Hey everybody. So, a question I'm asked often in person and here on the YouTubes is how much does all this stuff cost? $1 million. That's a bad joke, isn't it? It's like a dad joke. I'm not even a dad. Well, I got cats. My cat daddy. I make dad jokes. I've been making dad jokes since I was 8. It's actually not as expensive as you think. The equipment costs some money. We can go over that. Materials aren't too bad, though they are going up. This is why a lot of people are moving to resin, STL files, 3D prints. But we can talk about molds. So you guys have seen the molds. A mold blank, the organic black rubber molds, are $19 to $25 for a whole mold set, which is not too bad. Silicone molds are anywhere from that same price, $19 to $25 for one that vulcanizes at a normal temperature. Up to $50, $60 for some of the low temp molds. Some of the green molds that you've seen in some of my older videos are low temp, and so they vulcanize at half what a organic black rubber mold is. And so you'd only use those for masters, because they're lower temperature. The masters tend to survive, and because of silicone, they're a little softer, so you don't destroy a master as it sort of vulcanizes and you try to mash it into there. I do have a lot of trouble using 3D prints with any of the silicone molds. You can use a mold release. You can use spray paint, actually. It'll leave a film on the mold. That paint will come off any models, but that'll come off the first couple times you cast it. I don't really like either of those methods for 3D prints. It ends up obscuring detail. Maybe not a lot, but enough that I notice it. That one of the things you get on 3D prints that you get less of in a hand sculpted model, and I know some of you out there hand sculpting are going to bitch at me for this, but you can get some really crisp edges on belts and things, and sometimes that's a little artificial. Sometimes that's the sculptor just maybe being lazy about not putting a bevel or softening some edges. I'm guilty of that all the time, although it kind of fits my style. And when you put a bunch of mold release on the prints or a bunch of paint, then you run the risk of sort of obscuring those nice clean edges on armor and guns and the places you might want that. So I still do as you guys have seen, I still do my 3D prints in an organic black rubber mold. Not even because I'm cheap. Well, maybe. The other material is, of course, the pewter. And that is, as most people have heard, actually probably not most people, because who keeps up with tin prices? Did you know tin is a commodity? It's traded on the stock market, which means it goes up and down, up and down, up and down, up and down. And anytime there's a crisis or some country is upset with other countries, they restrict the tin output and prices skyrocket. It was a long time ago, I think, why Games Workshop, one of the reasons they got out of metal is you can't count on it. It's not stabilized. And when I first started making minis in the early 2000s, I think I was paying $4 or $5 a pound for 98% tin pewter. At the end of 2020, I think I was paying around $13 a pound, and now it's over 20 in just the past 6 or 7 months, with maybe no hope of stopping. Well, I guess eventually. And one of the things about that is, the price of metal may double, but you can't necessarily double the price of a miniature to the consumer. So a lot of that is cost you have to eat. Still, there's some profit in there. Maybe I shouldn't give this away because people are gonna be like, why do you charge so much for a mini if they're only 50 cents of metal? Because there's a lot of other stuff that goes into a mini. There's labor, there's waste. Not all the pewter is remeltable, etc. But it does take anywhere from 50 to 60 cents, maybe closer to 70 cents now, for a 28 millimeter figure, just in the metal. A 15 millimeter figure is down closer to 15 or 20 cents for some of them. Depends on if you're true 15 or you're 18 or whatever the kids are doing nowadays. So making a mini ends up, maybe with labor, everything around there is probably $1, maybe a little more than $1. Maybe like $10 if you want to pay yourself like $100 an hour. The material cost isn't huge. It is going up. It is definitely a concern. And it is more expensive than plastic, injection plastic, as far as materials go, but definitely not as far as machines go. So let's talk about machines a little bit. So my first machines were, let's see, what did I pay? I paid like $200 and a case of beer, literally, because I needed a welder, somebody who could do stainless steel, which is a special kind of welder. I don't know, I don't weld, but dude wanted a case of beer. I don't remember what a case of beer cost in the early 2000s. That's what he got. Thank you, Dad. Not his beer, somebody else. And then, you know, there are a bunch of professional machines, and I'll put some images up here of some of the machines. Like Conley Casting has their new venture system. That's $2,000 or $3,000 for everything. There's a company in the UK that's super cool. Their units are always sold out, I think, because they're popular. That you can get everything for like $1,200 or $1,500. I think. Probably depends on the pound to the dollar. So that probably fluctuates as much as tin does. But they've got a neat little machine that'll do 9-inch mold. It's got a little vulcanizing can, very similar to what I do. Actually, the new venture system is what I use now. Now that I don't use the home-built machine, I use the new venture system. And as I've mentioned in some of my other videos, I wasn't super happy with the vulcanizer. It worked. It made molds. But the element kept burning out on me, and as I've said before, it'd burn out like 2 or 3 times a year. It's $100 a pop and an hour's worth of labor. And what sucks about that is, for me, almost every time it blew out was on master models. And I'd end up breaking things, whatever, kind of taking it back apart because I didn't realize that the element was done. And so I'd open the mold the next day, and the rubber's uncured, and me pulling it apart has destroyed some masters, and I'd cuss and swear, and I'd throw things, and it was generally unpleasant. So anyhow, that's when I switched to the restaurant griddle, which, like I said, cost me like $300 or $400, and I think a replacement for it now is probably closer to $450, maybe $500, but that's still cheaper than, you know, $1,500 or $1,600 for their vulcanizing plate. Awkward pause here as I lose my train of thought. Oh, and the good thing about the griddle is because it's restaurant grade, and I'll link to it again, I've linked to it in other videos, because it's restaurant grade, it's made to run 7 days a week for hours and hours and hours and be fine. And so in the 5 or 6 years I've used it, the element's gone out exactly once, and that doesn't bother me. That's fine. I mean, that seems right to me for how long an element ought to last. It should be going out a couple times a year. And it's also easier to find that element than it is the element for the new venture vulcanizing plate. I'm not trying to badmouth those guys. I still use the machine. I love it. Some friends of mine in Louisiana also have the same setup and the same machine, and it works great for them. So I'm not badmouthing it. I just had some bad experience with it, and now I avoid it, except for the casting machine. And so then I get asked about injection molded plastic, and I'll put some links up here, and that is actually viable to do at home now. You're gonna spend $400 or $500 either for a small pre-built machine or for the parts that build a slightly larger machine, but the issue there is output. So you're only going to be able to make a couple inch by a couple inch mold for something you can do at home. The hoppers you can get for plastic and the pressure you can get, how much you can do per throw to fill a mold is relatively small. Maybe you get 2 or 3 28 millimeter figures in that mold. More than likely one. If you do maybe 15 millimeter figures, you'd get maybe 4. Maybe a few more. And once you get past like the $600 machines, there's $1,500 machines. The output is still not much greater than that. You're still limited in the volume of plastic you can push. And molds are maybe a little bigger. And then you start hitting $5,000, $7,000, $10,000, $20,000 to do these. And also the mold price goes up as you go. So in some of the smaller ones, you can get aluminum blocks, 2 halves, and they're sort of hollowed out on each side. And you can also get aluminum inserts for your mold. You can 3D print those inserts and inject them there. So there's a bunch of options there. And as you get bigger in the molds, then the more likely they need to be purely machined, so totally aluminum or steel, etc. If you do that in the U.S., that could be $5,000, $10,000, $25,000 for an injection mold. The bigger it is, maybe $100,000. You go to China, and they're $2,000 or $3,000, but then you've got the turnaround time and the stuff involved there. So what I do think the home injection molding would be good for is if you had 2 or 3 figures, poses, that you wanted to mass produce. And you could maybe do, somebody will correct me in the comments, you can maybe do 20 or 30 models an hour, depending on how quickly the plastic melts, and you can squeeze, and if you've got multiple molds. Whereas doing metal minis, I generate, if it's 28 millimeter miniatures and I'm just going, I could probably cast 200 an hour, roughly. Maybe a little less, depends on the mold and how many figures are in there. 15 millimeter, you can do a few hundred an hour, and 6 millimeter are just a pain in the ass, and you can do a bunch, but you're going to spend a bunch of time sorting 6 millimeter figures. That's the problem with those. So there's the output. So if you want to generate giant armies, lots of models, pewter is better than injection plastic. If you wanted an army, a squad of 10, that's 10 different molds. You're going to make like 2 squads an hour. Pewter, I'm going to make 50 squads an hour. And that's just more efficient. So the startup cost for pewter, and frankly probably the learning curve as well, is a little higher. There's a lot of folks that have started doing miniatures because of me, and I know I've apologized to you guys. I'm forever sorry. I did not earn my place in hell until I made my first casting video, and a bunch of you people listened to me. Hopefully you've all learned your lesson. But the learning curve there is steep. But then once you get it, and it kind of makes sense, it feels more magic than science quite often. There's a little bit of voodoo. It is more feel than math sometimes. I'm sure somebody knows the math, but for me it's more feel. And the first 3 molds you make, it's like anything else. The first 3 or 4 molds you make are going to fail. You're going to do something wrong. You're going to forget to put the cap notes in there, which I've done twice. Those molds still work though. There's some mucking about I got to do, but those molds still work. I still have them 20 years on. So there is a learning curve, but once you get it, it's maybe 4 or 5 weeks of work of really digging in. You'll get there. And I don't know what the learning curve is for the injection plastic. I think it's much lower if you're doing simple figures. So you can find a lot of videos on the web of people doing sort of toys, sort of rubbery things. And those are very, very simple. And if your models are simple, it's going to be easy. But if you're doing more complicated models, then my guess is that that's a little more difficult to make sure you get all the little bits filled. And then, of course, there's resin casting. Old school resin casting with pressure pots and all that, and that's also totally viable. And that you can expand your production capacity just by making more molds, by having more pressure pots. So that is a scalable business. One of the things that happens there is the molds that I make with the organic rubber last 4,000 or 5,000 spins, and that's a lot. I've worn some out, but that's a lot. I've bought some old molds from the 1980s, and they still work. Molds I made 20 years ago also still work. I can clean them up. Problem with the resin casting, and there's probably a bunch of people that have done that, because that's super easy to do at home and learn, is that most of your molds last like 30 or 40 pulls. Some less, depending on the resin and the molds, and some a little more, but usually not a lot more than that, unless you buy really expensive mold rubber. And so the problem with that is if you have a large line of figures, you are constantly making molds, just non-stop making molds. Every couple of weeks you're remaking the mold if you've got a lot of volume. And so you sort of need a department. You need like guys that do that, and guys that cast, and guys that run the pressure pot, or girls, sorry. You need all that. So that's viable. But the one I'm moving more and more towards is actually 3D printing. So I've been doing 3D printed master models for 5 or 6 years now. And recently with these $200 and $300 printers, it's easier for customers to purchase a printer, purchase digital files from all over the place, download them for free, whatever that may be, and print their own. There's still a lot of people that are resistant to that, which I totally get. It is a mess, can be a mess. And so having completely trained my customer base to buy 3D files and go out and buy a printer. So what I do is I print them as well. So I can show in the video. It's a little embarrassing now because it's filthy, but I've got a whole room that's basically my 3D printer farm. There's 9 printers in there of varying sizes. They're all from Frozen. So I've got one sort of tool chain to deal with. But it's totally viable to just 3D print all day. And the nice thing there, with 8 or 9 of them, I launch them all. 2 or 3 hours later, I come back, grab the prints off, launch them all again. And by the end of the day, so I did a Kickstarter where all of the vehicles were done as 3D prints, and there were thousands of vehicles I had to print, but I was doing 60 or 70 vehicles a day. It was the metal that was slow, not the prints with the print farm. And it's very little labor because you set it off, you go away, you come back 3 hours, you set it off, and so I could do 5 waves of printing a day. And I do feel like that's probably the future. I know people really like metal, but with tin going nuts, I feel like that's where we're headed. There's still some things to figure out. One of the issues is you guys have. Can I grab it? Let me grab one. You guys have all seen these models. They've got supports, and so one of the issues for me is when somebody orders 60 3D printed models, I've got to clean all those supports off. I don't think it's cool yet for me to send a model that still has the supports. Anthony thinks it is, and maybe one day it will be as people get used to it. But you've got to check for misprints. You've got to do that sort of thing. So maybe I could do it and charge a little less. But there's a ton of labor for a figure pulling these supports off. For a vehicle, it's less because I can put the vehicle on the build plate. And most of them just peel right off. Some of the figures I do are still a little delicate. And so I want to pull those supports off. So there's still that part to figure out, but that actually makes something like a 6mm figure 3D printed, and some of the 15mm figures a little more difficult because they're tiny, the supports are tiny. You're in there just clipping them, and that can get labor intensive. It could sometimes actually be harder to clean off a 15 than a 28. A lot of these 28s will just rip off once you know the model. And you print them 50 times, and you know exactly what you need to do to get those supports off. But it's still a whole bunch of labor. So for all those that are always asking me about injection molding, if you want to make little toys, little figures, totally go for it. Like, I look into it all the time. I'm always thinking about getting some little injection molder. I like to tinker. I like stuff. I got laser cutters and everything else here that I never use. So one day I'll probably end up doing some injection molding just because it's super cool to me. But it'll be trinkets. I don't think it'll be super detailed figures. I do think the future of it is 3D printing. The stuff will get better. Supports are getting easier to remove. The resins are getting better, which makes them easier to remove. And also, I'm getting better. Most of my figures now, when I print the first time, work. There might be a little bit that misprints, and I'll tweak that, reslice it, and print it again. So I'm almost at the point where 100% of what I do prints after the second or third try. So I use cheap resin to do some tests before I use the expensive resin for what I send to customers. So that's also getting easier too. So we'll see. So I just talked for like 20 minutes. I should make these videos shorter so people actually watch them. So I rambled a bit. Well, I rambled quite a bit. Hopefully that's okay. And if not, you stopped watching and you didn't see this part, and it doesn't matter if it's okay because you're a jerk and you've already left. But yeah, so I'm always happy to answer questions. For me, this channel, like, I don't know what to show you guys because, well, I made a mold. Didn't you learn how I do it? Aren't you an expert now? You ought to be. But you're obviously not. So feel free to send questions, and I'll do things like this. And hopefully you learn some stuff, and I'll get better at explaining stuff. So, cool. Thanks, guys. See ya. That was dumb. That's dumb. It's like I'm in the 70s. Fracking 70s. I'll cut that part out. No swearing. But thanks, guys. See you soon.